They say courage beats numbers, but what happens when the enemy commands 1,000 tanks and your only weapon is a machine gun designed 50 years ago? When survival means killing everything in sight, how long can one man truly defy a tidal wave of steel? Today, we look deep into the pit of impossible defense, where desperation meets defiance, and discover the true odds faced by the forgotten gunners holding the line at Sector Delta. The heat was a physical enemy, thick and metallic, smelling of spent casings and fear. Private Kalan adjusted the sights on his R5 for heavy Rapidra, workhorse of a weapon, but a dinosaur against the sleek composite hulls of the approaching ironclad legion. Look around. The 7th Rifles had less than 100 men scattered across 3 kilometers of crumbling earthen fortification. Their defense budget was decades overdue. Meanwhile, the enemy's advance reports showed aerial surveillance drones mapping every shadow, supported by self-propelled artillery that could target them from 50 miles away. Kellen's job was simple: hold this stretch of trenched spine of Sector Delta. If the spine broke, the capital fell within 48 hours. But the reality was grim. For every one of Kellen's outdated rounds, the enemy had 5,000 smart munitions. For every rifleman clinging to the dirt, the Legion had 10 armored personnel carriers waiting to roll over their graves. This wasn't a fair fight. This was a slow, agonizing execution. The air above Sector Delta wasn't just hot. It was caustic, vibrating with the residual energy of near-constant bombardment. Kalan and the rifle held the trenches. But the asterisk, real asterisk, fight, the one that dictated whether they lived to see dawn, was taking place 30 yards behind them. Inside, the crumbling bunker designated Artillery Position Prime. This housed the M88 Thunderer, the last serviceable heavy howitzer on this entire front. Its muzzle was the size of a drain pipe, stained black from 100 forgotten battles. Commanding it was Sergeant Tovin, a man whose face was etched with scars that looked less like wounds and more like geological formations. Tovin didn't talk much. He just listened to the whining of the cooling systems trying and failing to keep up with the infernal conditions. His crew, 3 boys barely old enough to shave, watched him with the quiet reverence afforded to those who could still calculate trajectories when everything else had devolved into panic. Torvin's silence wasn't just professionalism. It was a heavy shield against the knowledge of how impossibly bad their situation truly was. Torvin slapped the steel casing of the breech, the sound flat and dead in the humidity. Command crackled over the secure line, the voice tinny but urgent. Zulu 3, priority target. Enemy forward reconnaissance post 55 clicks out. They are coordinating the heavy strikes. Fire immediately. Torvin nodded, ignoring the calculation that confirmed his crew would only have 3 shells left after this volley. The M88 was their sledgehammer, but they were running dangerously low on nails, making this specific shot irreplaceable. He hunched over the Stenoptic sight standard issue across the entire Corps for the last 30 years. It was supposed to be reliable, robust. Torvin started the alignment procedure, the crosshairs dancing slightly. He keyed the distance adjustments, calibrating for the atmospheric density, the humidity spike, and the ground tremor caused by the legions approaching heavy armor. The sight gave him a preliminary trajectory solution, the red readout on the S10 post, waiting for confirmation. Torvin's finger hesitated above the firing stud. Something was profoundly wrong. He cross-referenced the preliminary solution with the analog back up a greasy plastic grid taped to the side of the weapon. The 2 figures were miles apart. Usually, a discrepancy of a few hundred meters was manageable. It could be wind shear or minor ground deformation, but this divergence was catastrophic. If they fired according to the S10's digital solution, they wouldn't just miss the target, they would hit their own abandoned supply depot 12 clicks behind enemy lines. The digital and analog readings conflicted drastically, suggesting a systemic failure, not just human error. Torvin swore softly, pulling his head back from the optics. The lenses felt strangely warm against his skin, even through his gloves. He wiped the glass, checking for dust, but the distortion persisted, subtle but lethal. "What is it, Sarge?" whispered Private Delano, wiping sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of soot. Torvin shook his head, focusing on the equipment, not the enemy. He ran the thermal diagnostic protocol, a quick burst of data transmitted to the fire control system. The return pinged back almost instantly, confirming what his gut already suspected. The problem wasn't the target data. The problem was the site itself. The failure was inherent to the site's design, tied directly to the extreme environmental condition. The S-10 site utilized the classic multi-element prism array designed to maximize clarity in cold weather engagements and standard temperate zones. But the current environment was neither. This pit was a furnace built of steel and concrete, radiating thermal energy back at the sun. The continuous metallic heat, amplified by the residual thermal bloom from dozens of nearby R-54 repeaters firing their heavy caliber rounds, was physically warping the housing of the S-10. More critically, the refractive index of the primary optical glass had shifted. The material, designed to withstand kinetic shock, was failing under thermal stress. The material designed for kinetic protection was precisely what failed under thermal stress, creating a fundamental weakness. The S-10, that supposedly robust piece of standard tissue technology, was useless. It was seeing ghosts. At a distance of 55 kilometers, a microscopic warp in the prism translated into a mismeasured in square miles. The enemy spotters were perfectly safe, untouchable by this precision weapon. This wasn't an equipment malfunction that could be fixed with a wrench or a recalibration code. This was a critical design flaw, exposed only under the relentless, sustained pressures of total war on a high-temperature front like Delta Sector. The military engineers had designed the S-10 for conventional conflicts, where artillery fired in short bursts and then cooled down. They had never planned for a scenario where the guns had to fire continuously for 72 hours straight, baking in a metal oven. The ironclad Legion must have known this. The Legion's strategy goes beyond firepower. They are intentionally utilizing thermal saturation to disable long-range defense. Torvin grabbed a heavy, waterlogged cooling cloth, usually reserved for the barrel end, draped it gingerly over the sight unit. Delano, get the field cooling unit focused solely on the S10 housing. Now, he barked, his voice losing its customary control. Torvin risks overheating the crucial gun barrel just to salvage the site, illustrating the desperate trade-off. They needed to drop the temperature of the optical array by 50 degrees in the next 3 minutes, or the target window would close. The enemy spotters, having done their job, would relocate, and the chance to disrupt the coordinated bombardment would vanish. Torvin watched the thermal readout drop agonizingly slowly. Every minute the site remained useless. The ironclad Legion's self-propelled artillery crept 5 miles closer. He realized the terrible irony. The only way to ensure the accuracy needed for a long-range shot imitates. Only strategic advantage was to wait for the heat to subside, to allow the metal to settle and the glass to regain its integrity. But if they waited, the enemy would close the gap, negating the need for long-range targeting altogether. The weapon's primary strategic value, long-range striking power, is nullified by the flaw, reducing it to a close-quarters tool. The M88 would be reduced to a glorified short-range mortar, useful only for blasting the APCs when they were already upon the trenches. Too late to save Sector Delta. We have 30 seconds, Sergeant. Tilano reported, his voice strained as the cooling unit whined desperately. Torvin looked back at the digital readout. The numbers were stabilizing, dipping briefly into a tolerable margin of error, but only just. The site was temporarily cooled externally, meaning the next shot would face the exact same immediate problem. He knew this shot was a gamble. If they missed, they wasted their second-to-last shell, and the site would immediately reheat, rendering the final shell useless too. If they hit, they bought Kalan and the rifles perhaps 12 crucial hours of respite before the Legion re-established coordination. He placed his eye back to the optic. The world snapped into focus, a moment of dangerous clarity. The clarity was terrifying because it forced Torvin to fire now, before the critical decision point could be properly debated. The crosshairs settled on the coordinates. He could see the faint heat signature of the reconnaissance post, an outpost nestled deep within the hostile desert mountains. The distance was immense, the margin for error razor thin, but for this fleeting second, the M88 was ready to unleash its true power. Torvin took a deep breath, ignoring the persistent, metallic smell that signaled the system was screaming under the duress of rapid thermal cycling. He had to trust that the brief cool down had brought enough integrity to compensate for the 30 years of outdated design. "Loader! Arm the breach! Shell for the Shalfa!" Hiti, Torvin yelled, the order cutting through the bunker's despair. The shell type Hiti, high explosive, hinted at the destructive power needed, but also increased the immediate thermal feedback on the gun. His crew snapped into practiced motion, slamming the heavy shell home. They knew the stakes. They knew the desperation. They knew that relying on a site that was essentially melting under the pressure of battle was suicide by trajectory. But they also knew that standing down meant certain, rapid defeat. This was the moment where obsolete technology met impossible demands, and the fate of the spine hung on a piece of cooling glass. If they failed this shot, the M88 would become nothing more than a monument to the war's most critical and avoidable engineering failure. Torvin brought his thumb down onto the firing. The final coordinates locked. But even as the firing sequence initiated, the red warning light on the S-10 flashed once, indicating the thermal threshold had been breached again. The shot was already on its way, traversing 55 kilometers toward a target that might no longer be where the faulty scope told them it was. The warning light flashed asterisk after asterisk firing, leaving the ultimate result of the shot unknown and precarious. The thunderous roar of the M88 shook the entire bunker, drowning out the frantic whine of the cooling unit and leaving behind only a ringing silence filled with dust and uncertainty. Did they buy Sector Delta time? Or did they just sign their own death warrant? The silence was damning, thick, and sudden, like a heavy blanket dropped over an explosion. Torvin gripped the console, his knuckles white against the scorched plastic, waiting for the crucial feedback that the universe refused to provide. The M88's thunder faded, instantly replaced by the shrill, frantic whine of proximity alerts. The incoming heat signature wasn't an echo. It was the inevitable answer to their unauthorized shot. He needed to know if they had bought time or merely illuminated their position for the counter. The question hung heavy. Was the shot a hit, or did it just highlight their coordinates for swift extermination? He didn't wait for the comms officer to finish screaming the status report for Sector Delta. Numbers were useless now. The scope display was dark, a cracked obsidian mirror reflecting only failure. Torvin shoved the useless system aside, kicking the cooling unit back into a grinding, desperate life. He knew what was coming next. Orbital strike trajectory correction based precisely on their muzzle flash coordinates. Time was measured now in the decay rate of the sound waves they had just generated, minutes at best, likely seconds. He heard the analysis from the sublevel filtered through static. confirming the worst fear: the counterattack wasn't coming from the known engagement zone, but swinging wide, hitting them from the forgotten northern flank. Survival demanded a physical fix. Torvin's mind flashed back to Riker's obsolete maintenance manual, the forgotten schematics detailing the MAT-8's emergency alignment jigs equipment designed for training drills. Not this final, terrifying battle. He needed 2 fixed points, separated by a measured distance, aligned meticulously to the barrel's central axis. Without authorization, and definitely without consultation, he started tearing into the primary ventilation shaft shielding. This was far past unauthorized. This was a court-martial offense if they lived, but the only option if they wanted to die fighting. What if the initial misalignment wasn't the scope's failure, but the structural mounting plate beneath the entire massive gun, subtly warping under decades of pressure? The shielding was thick, resilient, metal, tough, but pliable enough for brute force. He ripped free a long, thin strut, usually tasked with stabilizing a voltage power conduit. It was perfectly straight, which was all that mattered. He needed a stable reference point near the gun's core. His eyes locked onto the primary cooling shunt casing, a massive block of titanium bolted directly and securely to the cannon's breech. This was the one stable anchor in a world of vibration. The casing had a strange, subtle discoloration near the top, a shade of metallic blue that Torvin had only witnessed once before, decades ago, during the infamous fusion melt incident on the training ground. Using his heavy, worn field knife and the hefty wrench as an improvised hammer, he began beating the strut flat on the floor plating, shaping it into a crude siding bar. Every forceful strike echoed the frantic rhythm of the incoming distant shelling. He wasn't chasing precision optics. He was relying on raw, repeatable physics. His goal was to establish a solid line of sight running perfectly parallel to the barrel bore. Using the fundamental angle of the Earth's local magnetic field as a zero reference to concept, the MAT-8's automated systems routinely dismissed as primitive and unreliable. The field knife wasn't standard military issue. It was a rough relic passed down to him from his grandfather, who had fought and survived the previous low-tech conflict. He needed some form of magnification, even a basic, slight enhancement for target definition. He spotted the shattered remnants of the S-10 scope's main eyepiece lens, a small convex shard still stubbornly clinging to the mangled frame. He carefully pried the piece free, slicing a shallow, stinging nick into his palm. Blood instantly mixed with the grime and heavy grease coating the metal parts. The piece of glass felt strangely warm to the touch, indicating that the catastrophic thermal stress on the S-10 might have been entirely internal, suggesting a deliberate and hidden sabotage deep within the gun's complex wiring harness. He stripped repurposed sensor wire, using them to lash the newly fashioned sighting bar the conduit strut to the immovable cooling shunt casing, aligning it as meticulously as his eye and desperate hope allowed. He rigged the jagged, convex glass shard near the muzzle end of the jury-rigged sight, creating a rudimentary pinhole aperture system. It wouldn't zoom, but it could align. It could point. The specific sensor wires he utilized were officially tagged with the identifying marker. Decommissioned Sector 7 materials that, according to rigid operational guidelines, should have been melted down and recycled 3 fiscal quarters prior. Now came the terrifying physics calculation. Using the manual elevation WWII lever the crew hadn't touched in nearly 5 years, he cranked the M88's massive barrel down to a perfect zero elevation. He needed an absolutely precise horizontal plane. He grabbed his secondary communication device, slammed it onto the deck, shattering the screen, and used the internal gyroscopic level reader carefully calibrating his makeshift sighting bar against the device's internal bubble reading. That destroyed comms device was their only secure, authenticated link to high command. And now it was ruined, isolating them completely, just as the automated systems flashed confirmed. High velocity, counterattack, status, incoming. The proximity alert instantly changed pitch. It was no longer distant shelling, but high G, rapid atmospheric entry, close range. They had achieved bunker targeting lock. Torvin violently shoved the crude, jury-rigged sighting apparatus into its final position, securing it with a heavy, rusted clamp salvaged from the discarded targeting motor. It was crooked, incredibly ugly, and reeked of sheer, unadulterated desperation. The enemy projectile wasn't standard ballistic ordnance. The sensor logs briefly reported a sharp energy spike, suggesting an energy-dampening stealth cruiser, using the dust cloud from their previous shot as immediate heavy cover. Torvin ignored the Kum's officers' hysterical pleas to abandon the post. He squinted hard through the rough glass shard. The world viewed through the homemade lens was blurry, vibrating with the continuous stress. But the fixed alignment line he had desperately created, the straight edge of the conduit strut, was geometrically solid. He calculated the lead time for the rapidly approaching object by pure estimation, relying on the change in sound frequency and vibration dampening rather than the defunct radar. He keyed in the manual trajectory override sequence. That lead calculation, he realized instantly, wasn't based on military doctrine, but on the visceral childhood experience of throwing stones at fast-moving air gliders near his hometown, a small farming village now completely vaporized by the war. The crude sight held momentarily steady. He caught the distinct sudden flicker of the incoming threat dart, rapidly growing shadow tearing across the low horizon. He adjusted the M88's massive elevation ever so slightly, trusting the hastily bolted metal strut infinitely more than 50 million credits worth of defunct optical engineering. He slammed his bloodied hand down onto the firing stud, praying basic high school geometry would finally outweigh catastrophic thermal failure, even through the deafening roar of the MRT-8's secondary shot. Torvin heard a new, distinct, high-pitched metallic whine coming from deep within the core structure of the gun itself, a noise that instantly suggested the recoil might finally rip the entire weapon system from its foundational moorings this time. The immediate, violent shuddering of the station registered even on the secure monitors of the command deck. General Velt, his face a mask of stone, watched the data flow, or the Sadan, terrifying lack thereof. The successful primary shot, confirmed moments ago, had used a targeting solution flagged universally as non-standard override, integrity 0.003%. They knew Torvin had bypassed every single safety measure, but the extent of the actual physical improvisation was still being laboriously pieced together by nervous technicians. The shot had been pure, dumb luck, they told themselves repeatedly. It absolutely had to be. Then the auxiliary camera feed, shaky and prone to distortion from the massive heat bloom still emanating from the M88's breach, provided the shocking visual evidence. Velt's adjutant, Major Kress, visibly flinched and swore under his breath, bolted crudely onto the main chassis. Replacing the multispectral optical array worth millions was a filthy piece of salvaged conduit bracing, aligned purely by eye and secured with heavy-gauge industrial clips. It was an insult to the billion-credit defense grid they were supposed to be operating and protecting. Zoom level 5. Stabilize that image immediately, Kress, Vel commanded, his voice unervingly quiet, a terrible flatness in his tone. I want to see the precise details of the trajectory markings, if there are any at all. Kress adjusted the feed, revealing 3 deep, ragged scratches etched into the salvaged metal pipe. These weren't factory calibrations. They looked distressingly like tally marks scored into a prison cell wall. The command software engineers immediately tried to reverse engineer the absurdly crude geometry displayed. They inputted the coordinates of the successful first shot, attempting to correlate the known trajectory with the visual alignment of the strut itself. The results the computer spat back were nonsensical and violently contradictory. The system calculated a necessary elevation that was exactly 1.4 degrees off what Torvin had used, a divergence that, under normal circumstances, should have caused the round to miss the rapidly incoming kinetic strike craft by miles and miles. The core targeting computer, sputtering back to life in limited capacity, flashed a critical error, impossible correlation coefficient. Chief Engineer Danton ran a hurried diagnostic loop, his brow slick with anxiety. He realized the system wasn't malfunctioning in the standard sense. It was failing to comprehend the sheer instinctual physics Torvin had employed, treating it like a ghost variable. General, with all due respect, we absolutely cannot rely on this, Danton pleaded, jabbing a desperate finger at the monitor screen where the makeshift sight loomed obscenely large. It's purely a statistical anomaly, a terrifying fluke. Attempting a second shot using this asterisk contraption asterisk is functionally the same as firing utterly blind. If we give him clearance to fire again based solely on his judgment, we are risking the entire station on a glorified, desperate coin toss. Weltz did not look at Danton. He was focused only on the tactical display. The second threat wave was closing dangerously fast. They had maybe 90 seconds before their point of no return. 90 seconds to decide if doctrine and protocol mattered more than proven, albeit undeniably insane, results. Welt had spent 40 years building a career on structured redundancy and absolute blind adherence to the standard operating procedures manual. To cite that barbaric scrap of piping was a profound affront to everything he held sacred in the universe. Yet, the spreading debris field of the first destroyed interceptor was currently broadcasting a silent, irrefutable message of success. If he vetoed Torvin now, and the second wave breached their defenses, the history books would judge him a fool who died clinging pedantically to a user manual. He had to quantify the unquantifiable immediately. He finally turned to Kress. "Get me the maintenance logs for Sector 7 Gamma. I want to know exactly what kind of alloy that strut is made of." Now, it felt ridiculous, borderline insane, but he desperately needed some kind of foothold in technical reality. Meanwhile, Torvin, completely oblivious to the high-stakes existential debate raging in the command deck high above him, was nursing a freshly split lip and wiping his own blood from the very same crude sight. The recoil had been brutal, jolting the entire emplacement violently. He hadn't expected the system to hold up, and the new high-pitched whine was definitely structural, not merely acoustic. He knew the next shot, if there was to be one, would likely be the very last for the M88, and possibly for him. He focused intently on the strut, noticing a dangerous hairline fracture spiderwebbing near the base where it was clipped to the cannon. The sight was failing, just like the official multi-million credit systems, only marginally slower. He needed to make the next shot count, and he needed to make it fast. Back on the command deck, the engineers were attempting a desperate soft synchronization maneuver. They proposed using the few remaining functional gyroscopes to track the incoming targets and feed that bare data to Torvin's console, hoping he could use his improvised geometry to translate the calculated angle onto the physical strut. It was an act of faith bordering on professional madness. "General, if we send him this data, we are implicitly endorsing the modification," Kress warned, his voice tight. "If he misses reliability, The inevitable court-martial will be yours alone to carry. Velt nodded slowly, accepting the burden. Start the transmission. Major, we need to know if this instinct is replicable in any form, or if Torvin is simply the luckiest man currently alive in this sector. The tension coiled tighter still, the entire command waiting with bated breath for the system's confirmation blink. The initial data feed finally reached Torvin's battered console. The trajectory markers appeared overlaid, digitized ghost lines hovering just above the physical strut. He squinted, trying desperately to reconcile the cold, sterile mathematics of the digital feed with the visceral, honest feel of the worn metal beneath his fingers. He shifted the massive elevation slightly, carefully aligning the improvised scratch mark with the computer's calculated overlay. The immediate feedback loop was terrifyingly clear. The system registered a 0.2-degree offset, critical enough for a guaranteed miss. He realized he was instinctively moving the gun away, from the computer's optimal trajectory. His hand hesitated for one long moment. Was his raw childhood intuition truly superior to billions in computational power and failed engineering? He paused, then ignored the digital overlay completely, relying solely on the change in sound frequency and the faint, familiar vibration of the rapidly approaching enemy. On the deck, alarm sirens began to chirp hysterically, signaling the crossing of the outer perimeter defense line. Velt watched the sensor readings jump wildly as Torvin disregarded the synchronized data entirely. "He's ignoring the calibration," Kress whispered, horrified, as if watching a suicide. "He's moving based on pure feel, General. He's rejecting the data." Velt slammed his hand onto the console's armrest. This was not war. This was divination. But the ship was dying, and the clock had finally run out. Lock down the manual override. Give him the clearance. "And Kress," Velt said, his voice husky with resignation, his eyes fixed on the dirty strut, "start recording the exact oscillation frequency of the M88 during the next discharge cycle. If we somehow survive this, we need to know precisely what noise sounds like salvation." Torvin felt the deep thrumming approaching, closer now, a low resonance shaking the very foundations of his core structure. He ignored the digital readouts, flashing angry red warnings across his visor. He trusted the scratches on the conduit strut, the phantom memory of skipping stones against a childhood pond, and the rising, deadly pitch of the enemy whine. He deliberately didn't look at the hairline cracks spreading across his improvised sight. He took a single, deep breath, centered the massive weapon system using only the muscle memory built from decades of obsolete training, and tightened his bloodied grip on the firing stud. The second enemy's shadow grew enormous across his tiny, improvised field of view. He waited for the exact, perfect moment the stressed metal screamed loudest, ready to prove that the human heart, when desperate enough, could compute faster than any failing microchip. Torvin didn't need the sensors anymore. The world outside the bunker screamed its denial, a sound that wasn't just noise but a physical assault, punching the air from his lungs. The second shadow, identified only by Velt's panicked whisper moments earlier as the Harvester-class interdictor, wasn't just enormous. It was silent, its sheer mass absorbing the chaotic atmosphere around it. He fired not the weapon, but a tiny, internal burst of adrenaline. The M88, built 3 generations ago, was never designed to handle the velocity of a Harvester attack. Its maximum safe rotational speed had been quietly surpassed 10 minutes ago, a fact Torvin had concealed even from Velt. The digital failsafe finally engaged a useless gesture. The main targeting array shattered, not from enemy fire, but from the M88's own mechanical overload. Velt yelled something about structural integrity, but the comms were already fading into static, swallowed by the electromagnetic wash of the approaching Leviathan. Torvin's focus narrowed entirely to the tiny 3-inch shard of polished conduit pipe he had taped haphazardly to the barrel shroud's improvised sight. He had minutes, maybe less than 60 seconds, before the harvester reached the minimum effective range where its area suppression field would render the M88 completely inert. The specific angle of the tape and the slight bend in the metal shard were based on the trajectory calculations Torvin developed decades ago, trying to hit a specific, notoriously stubborn fishing buoy off the coast of a world that no longer existed, a pointless pastime that had somehow become their only hope. The problem wasn't merely aiming, it was environmental compensation. The bunker was listing badly, perhaps 3 degrees off-center now, meaning the required firing solution needed constant, minute adjustment for rotational drift. His decades of training, discarded by the modern military as too slow, became his only processing core. He ignored the burning ache in his shoulders and the thick, hot blood coating the manual override levers. He had to calculate the M88's barrel warp coefficient based solely on the color of the heat bloom spreading across the muzzle. Velt's frantic, filtered message finally cut through the noise. Torvin, the oscillation isn't random, it's synchronized. The M88 is vibrating in perfect antiphase with the harvester's core hum. It's trying to harmonize the metal to the point of catastrophic failure. He didn't think in numbers or angles. He thought in pressure points and echoes. The harvester was decelerating, a fatal mistake born of arrogance. Assuming victory was inevitable now that the defenses were gutted. This provided a fleeting opportunity, a moment of less chaotic movement. Torvin had to fire precisely during the transition between the enemy's maximum rotational speed and its planned final stationary lock, a window lasting 0.4 seconds. If he missed that window, the subsequent stabilization wave would deflect the round completely. He saw the target, not the main armor, but the tiny, constantly venting thermal exhaust port hidden beneath the harvester's primary sensor bank. He had one round chambered that stood any Chansa relic, a solid core kinetic penetrator designed for orbital fortifications, not mobile assault ships. The maintenance logs, buried deep in his forgotten memory, confirmed that this specific kinetic round had a known Krichika flaw. The magnetic stabilization. Fins often failed to deploy correctly at peak velocity, meaning the shot would tumble unless fired at a very specific, unnaturally low muzzle temperature. Torvin fought the instinct to cool the barrel. The metal needed to scream asterisk, just enough asterisk to align the shot, but not so much that the round's stabilization failed. He pressed his face hard against the strut, ignoring the metallic taste of dust and copper, using the residual vibrations of the conduit as a final, tactile gyroscope. He felt the minute shift in weight as Velt must have braced himself against the wall, ready for impact or victory. The air pressure dropped violently as the harvester's massive shadow encompassed the bunker entrance entirely. Torvin calculated the final drift, 8 feet left, 3 feet down. Factoring in the rotational energy still stored in the collapsing foundation, the improvised sight, the piece of scrap metal showed the exhaust port winking into alignment, but only for a fraction of a heartbeat. To counteract the bunker's lateral roll, Torvin consciously jammed his left forearm into the exposed gear housing of the manual traverse mechanism. Using the resistance of bone and muscle grinding against the teeth of the machinery to hold the alignment steady for the critical tenth of a second, a move that guaranteed shattered tissue and permanent nerve damage, the digital warnings flashed asterisk, red, red, black. Asterisk, the M88's internal systems were dead. Torvin was alone with the physics of the shot. He heard Velt's muffled plea, Torvin, now. But he waited. He didn't trust Velt's electronic timing. He trusted the sound. He waited for the very precise frequency where the M88's metal shriek matched the high metallic whine of the harvester's thermal regulation system. Thermal moment of perfect, deadly resonance. The improvised sight settled, blurring slightly as the hairline crack in the conduit strut widened under the massive G. The world was reduced to that single, shimmering target, the tiny exhaust port demanding their salvation. The pressure built in his grip. His thumb hovered over the firing stud, slick with blood. A sudden, horrifying realization struck Torvin. The M88's housing was manufactured from the same specific, obsolete alloy as the harvester's main cooling banks. If the shot hit too cleanly, the resulting sympathetic explosion might not just destroy the enemy, but potentially vaporize the bunker and everything within a mile radius. He stopped breathing. The sound hit the peak frequency, a high-pitched keening that felt like tearing silk. His muscles spasmed, forcing the weapon system to hold. He didn't pull the trigger. He squeezed it, a deliberate, agonizing process of compression. The discharge was not the roaring thunder expected of the M80. It was a choked, violent expulsion, a single, blinding spike of energy tearing through the enclosed space. The recoil was apocalyptic, throwing Torvin backward, his injured arms screaming in protest as the mechanical gears shredded his flesh. For a moment, there was nothing but white noise and the smell of ozone and burnt lubricant. Because of the barrel's severe overheating and the non-deployment of the kinetic fins, the round exited the M88 not as a stable projectile, but as a burning, rotating drill, momentarily stabilizing only because it was traversing the harvester's focused magnetic suppression field. Torvin hit the back wall, coughing, fighting through the ringing deafness. The darkness was absolute. Had he missed, the sheer mass of the harvester should have blocked out the remaining light regardless. But the bunker walls should still be vibrating with its proximity. Silence. A silence deeper and more unsettling than the noise. Velt's voice. Now a thin, reedy ghost over the dead comes, whispered. Torvin. Oscillation ceased. Target signature decaying. Catastrophic thermal runaway confirmed. It was done, but the physical impact they should have felt was missing. The final, devastating twist. The harvester hadn't exploded outward. It had collapsed inward, imploding under the massive internal pressure shift, creating a brief, localized gravity well that had temporarily erased all sound and lightened. Now the bunker foundation was slowly being sucked toward the resulting void. Torvin scrambled back to the control pedestal, ignoring the mangled state of his left arm, which felt like wet ropes hanging from a shattered socket. The makeshift sight was gone, probably vaporized in the muzzle flash. He slapped the manual override levers. The internal structure was groaning, the sound of stressed metal giving way not to external pressure, but to an unnatural, centralized vacuum. Velt's status screen, miraculously flickering back to life, showed a zero reading for external air pressure. Velt wasn't responding to the silence. His last visible action, captured by the optical feed, showed him fighting desperately to pull himself away from the central observation slit, his body weight suddenly insufficient to counteract the unnatural suction force, pulling him toward the harvester's implosion point. Torvin had solved the problem of the attack, only to introduce a far more exotic, existential threat. The kinetic round had destroyed the core, yes, but in doing so, it had destabilized the harvester's anti-gravity stabilizers, turning a military target into a miniature black hole. Torvin grabbed the emergency release handle for the M88 itself. He had to jettison the entire system before the vacuum ripped the weapon from its housing and took the bunker with it. The system clearance Velt had given earlier, meant to enable the manual override, had actually locked the M88 into a deep cycle stabilization mode, meaning Torvin couldn't manually release the weapon without entering a complex three-stage authentication code that required Velt's physical key. Torvin felt the air pressure drop sharply, a physical punch to the lungs that stole his breath. The bunker door seals were screaming, a high-pitched metallic whine protesting the external void. Velt's body was now entirely horizontal, held fast by the invisible, powerful current pulling him towards the observation slit. Torvin slammed his fist against the MRT-8's control panel, the digital lock blinking a mocking, angry red. He needed that Velt's key, but Velt was 5 meters away, currently serving as an anchor point in the apocalypse. The system wasn't asking for a chip or a card. It required active proximity authentication. Torvin realized the key wasn't physical, it was biometric data, still stored in Velt's proximity reader, still active. The feed showed Velt's wrist-mounted reader glowing faintly, agonizingly close to the lethal pull of the singularity. Torvin had maybe 20 seconds before the structural integrity of the bunker failed completely, and the M88, built specifically to withstand cosmic forces, became the only solid thing left, dragging the rest of the ruined complex with it. He couldn't drag Velt back. He needed leverage. Torvin saw an alternative. The M88 had a forgotten emergency kinetic anchor point, designed for exactly this kind of situation. But activating it meant permanently welding the gun to the housing, a one-time sacrifice he wasn't yet ready to make. Gritting his teeth, Torvin kicked off the floor, launching himself across the narrow space, not toward the release handle, but toward Velt. He used the accelerating vacuum against itself, a terrifying slingshot maneuver. He reached the Velt just as the larger man's helmet grazed the edge of the observation slit. The glass already spider-webbed with Torvin grabbed Velt's suit harness, but the pull was immense, like trying to pull an aircraft carrier with a piece of twine. He couldn't drag Velt back. He could only hold position. But then Torvin noticed a nearly invisible secondary cable connection on Velt's Suta legacy system for power transfer that might bypass the biometric lock if he could reroute the signal. The secondary power transfer Kabbalah, useless piece of legacy tech, usually reserved for charging suits in external magnetic fields, was hanging loose near Velt's elbow. It was a standard Type-C connector, designed for sheer ubiquity, not security. If Torvin could clip that into the M88's auxiliary diagnostic port, he might siphon the necessary authentication data directly from Velt's Sutos. It was a wildly illegal move, bypassing all protocols. But protocols were meaningless when reality was folding in on itself. The risk was that the data transfer would overload Velt's already stressed life support systems. Adding to the immediate dilemma, the auxiliary port was located near the barrel housing, meaning he had to fight the suction force directly while attempting the precise, vital connection. The air was thin, cold, and metallic. Torvin clung to Velt's harness with one hand, his fingers slipping on the rigid material. With the other, he unclipped the legacy cable, the plastic insulation cracking instantly in the extreme environment. He had to cross the cabin again, fighting the intensifying current back toward the weapon's massive breech block. The harvester's implosion was nearing critical mass. The sound was no longer a whine, but a deep, resonant hum, shaking the floor plates loose. Torvin threw the cable across the bunker, the lightness of the item making it easily catch the centralized current, pulling it directly toward the observation slit instead of the M88. He had failed the throw, but the vacuum had succeeded. The cable snapped taut, wrapping around the emergency manual release levada, one requiring Velt's key code lithe, a perfect lasso. Torvin now had a crude, non-authorized connection to the primary release mechanism, albeit via Velt's suit. He pulled hard. The cable didn't break. Instead, Velt's wrist communicator flashed, registering a spike in unauthorized data transfer, signaling the system had recognized Velt's presence, if not his deliberate intent. The M88's red lock light sputtered, briefly flashing green. The system didn't just unlock. It interpreted the massive, illegal data spike as an asterisk, attack asterisk, triggering an automatic, accelerated jettison sequence instead of a controlled release. Asterisk. Immediate jettison. Asterisk. The automated sequence was far faster and more brutal than a manual release. Torvin barely had time to brace himself. Hydraulic seals blew, not with a gentle hiss, but a deafening asterisk. Crack. Asterisk. The M88, all 40 tons of hardened mass, was violently ejected from the bunker housing. The sudden, violent displacement of mass created a chaotic counterforce, a momentary, localized pressure wave that fought against the vacuum. Torvin and Veltz were instantly thrown sideways, slamming into the reinforced bulkhead, escaping the pull just as the observation glass shattered, turning the slit into a gaping, hungry maw. Outside, the catastrophe inverted itself. The ejected M88, rather than flying clear, hit the destabilized harvester structure exactly where the original kinetic strike had entered, acting as a massive, unintended structural plug. The M88 was massive, dense, and built from materials designed to resist deep space torsion. It didn't just fly away, it became a blunt, irresistible object, impacting the unstable singularity. The enormous gun struck the collapsing harvester where the core had been, sealing the wound. The kinetic effect was immediate and absolute. The miniature black hole effect didn't disappear, but it was instantaneously contained bottlenecked, turning the uncontrolled, spreading vacuum into a highly localized, muffled roar. The exterior threat had been corked temporarily by the very weapon designed to stop it. The sudden stabilization, however, wasn't perfect. The harvester, now partially sealed, began venting massive amounts of stored, superheated anti-gravity plasma through secondary ports, turning the surrounding valley into a plasma furnace. The immediate danger of the vacuum implosion inside the bunker was gone, replaced by the sound of heavy, searing rain outside. Torvin struggled to his feet, gasping in the now thin but stable atmosphere. He pulled Velt back, away from the shattered slit. Velt was unconscious, bleeding from a dozen internal ruptures caused by the decompression shockwave, but alive. Torvin checked the exterior feed. The tactical picture had flipped from zero visibility and certain destruction to a confusing, chaotic victory. The harvester, though contained, was now a massive, sputtering geyser of blinding blue plasma. The enemy forces, relying entirely on the harvester's plan, silent infrastructure collapse, were suddenly exposed, surprised, and caught mid-maneuver by the unexpected plasma wave. The enemy's infantry, the highly disciplined Obsidian Legion, had been moving into position, anticipating a soft entry into a vacuum-sterilized zone. Instead, they were met with a kilometer-wide radius of spontaneous thermonuclear fury. Their thermal cloaks were useless. Their armor melted instantly. The harvester, in its dying throes, had become the ultimate anti-infantry weapon. Disruption was too soft a word. It was annihilation. Their momentum, the disciplined, relentless march that had worried Torvin for weeks, didn't just halt. Atomisé. Torvin noticed a secondary effect. The massive electromagnetic pulse, EMP, generated by the plasma vent had inadvertently brought online an ancient, forgotten, defensive satellite network. Torvin stared at the tactical screen, which was now flickering with new, unprecedented data. The EMP blast, a chaotic byproduct of the harvester's containment, had been immense. It was so powerful, it had woken up the dormant 70-year-old orbital defense grid. The Watchman satellites, long thought, decommissioned, and rusted into scrap. Their targeting systems were ancient, slow, and probably inaccurate, but they were active. The grid saw the massive plasma bloom and the concentrated enemy forces surrounding it. It registered one thing: a massive central target. Crucially, the Watchman satellites didn't target the infantry. They targeted the source of the energy spike, identifying the harvester itself as the prime threat and initiating a localized orbital bombardment protocol meant for prehistory Before Torvin could even process the ridiculousness of the situation, the first warning sirens blared from above, not their own, but the ancient, screeching tone of the watchman targeting Locke. He watched on the exterior feed as a series of heavy, tungsten rods moving at fractions of light speed slammed down from the heavens. They weren't laser-guided, they were pure kinetic force, designed to erase mountains. The impossible shot had connected. The weapon had been jettisoned, and now the subsequent chaos had activated a ghost army from orbit. The battle wasn't just won, it was being rewritten by machines built 2 generations ago, triggered by an accidental EMP, finishing the job the M88 started. The Harvester vanished, erased by kinetic judgment from above. Where victory should have roared, there was only the metallic silence of total annihilation. The Watchman's satellites, their ancient protocol fulfilled, slipped back into their silent, high-altitude vigil. Torvin was pulled from the wreckage, deafened by the cheers echoing across the fractured landscape. He was Ahira, the man whose accidental genius saved the sector, but as the relief washed over him, it tasted like ash. His fix had traded a tactical loss for strategic terror. He had woken the ghost army, and now they knew exactly how to wake again. Later, in the sterile light of the debriefing room, the true cost materialized. The Watchman logs, preserved for posterity, showed a secondary entry triggered by the overwhelming energy signature of his jettisoned weapon. Threat signature M88, registered source code human catalyst. He hadn't just saved lives, he had proven to the ancient machines that humanity itself remained the greatest variable, the most unpredictable superweapon. The moral weight crushed him. He was celebrated for an act that ensured the Watchman would never truly sleep again. He was the perpetual burden, the man whose life was saved by condemning the future to eternal surveillance. The conflict was not extended. It was merely internalized, a constant dread vibrating beneath the thin veneer of peace. The cost of ingenuity is rarely the metal. It is always the soul of the engineer. The only thing worse than fighting a war is realizing you are the trigger for the next one. Thank you for watching this concluding chapter. If this story sparked a reflection on the true meaning of victory, please like this video, subscribe for more epic sci-fi content, and tell me in the comments, was Torvin a hero or a harbinger?